So today we're going to go over the major body cavities. All right. So the body cavities are basically where your organs are contained. So what organs are contained and protected within the various cavities of the body? And you should be able to identify all the cavities and including the big ones and all the smaller cavities that make up the big ones. A lot of the terms over here are different various cavities. So you're going to learn about all these different cavity terms. Several of them overlap, and some of them are arbitrary divisions, meaning they're not true separations. They're just kind of separations that we as scientists made up. Okay? And you want to know the difference between both. Okay, so in your body, there's actually two true huge body cavity divisions. One is the dorsal cavity and the other is the ventral cavity. So cavities are enclosed spaces that separate, surround, and protect your body structures. So think of them as pockets inside your body that are capable of holding lots and lots of looser organs that aren't just muscle and bone. Okay? So when you think of your organs, a lot of people think of the heart, lungs, liver, stomach. Those are the kinds of organs that you're going to find inside a cavity. So the two truest cavities are the dorsal cavity and the ventral cavity. So the dorsal cavity is the yellow stuff here. And the dorsal cavity itself is completely separated from the ventral cavity. As in, I cannot get from the dorsal cavity to the ventral cavity without shoving through and chiseling away bone and muscle. Okay? Now, the ventral cavity is up in the front over here. Now, the ventral cavity does have separate mini pockets within it, but they're like soft divisions. They're divisions made of either muscle or thin sheets of tissue, and you can break through them with a pair of scissors very easily. Kind of think of it as, you have a drawer in your dresser, and the drawer in your dresser, you may have like some soft dividers inside of that. That's kind of the way the ventral cavity is divided. Okay? Now, all these cavities include the smaller cavities are lined with membranes, and those membranes, just reminding you, are thin sheets of tissues that cover and protect the organs. So, meaning that the very outer edges of these pockets have like thin protective sheets that help protect it, help protect the softer organs inside, and connect those organs to the side walls. And over here on the ventral cavity, you have both a big protective sheet on the very edge, and then even within that, you have your own separate protective sheets, thin sheets within each region to kind of attach the organs to the cavity, side walls, as well as give a little bit more cushioning and protection. Okay, so example of cavity membranes. It's kind of hard to describe. A lot of students don't quite understand what I mean by membrane. So membranes are like thin sheets of tissues that kind of stick to the edges of organs. Now, many of you may not cook raw meat, but if you actually cook raw meat, you're going to see it sometimes. Sometimes you're going to see this like thin film that's held right over your meat or the organs of an animal, and that is a cavity membrane. So this thin film here, that's a classic example of a cavity membrane. You're going to get familiar with them if we have the opportunity to do dissections this year, especially a whole animal dissection, if that's available. Okay, so let's go over our two cavities, the dorsal cavity and the ventral cavity. So first we're going to go over the dorsal cavity. So the dorsal cavity is the big cavity that's located on the back side or posterior of the human body. So if you have a side view of a person, the dorsal cavity is right here. It's the orange stuff. From a front view, so this is an anterior view of a person's facing forward in this image. The dorsal body cavity you kind of see in the head and the neck, and then it sits behind the ventral cavity, which is why you only see the dorsal cavity. Oops, sorry you guys. Dorsal cavity in a little bit of this second image over here, but not the whole thing. Okay? So the dorsal cavity, again, is this whole thing over here. Not tracing it precisely, but you get the idea. Okay, so the dorsal cavity is actually one solid pocket. There is no subdivisions within that pocket, natural ones. There's no clear separations. So we just make up the region. So the cranial cavity section of the dorsal cavity, it merges directly into the spinal or vertebral cavity of this pocket. There is no like separating membrane between them. They all just kind of, the brain in the cavity merges directly into the spinal cord in the spinal or vertebral cavity. Okay? So they're kind of arbitrary divisions that we anatomists made up. So the dorsal cavity is a true pocket, and then the cranial cavity refers to the space of the dorsal cavity that sits inside the skull. And the spinal cavity, also known as vertebral cavity, refers to the section of the dorsal cavity pocket that sits within the spine. Okay? Now, some students get a little bit confused about spinal cavity. It's not the same thing as your spinal column, your spinal bones. So this is your spinal bones, and you may not realize this, but inside your spinal bones, each of these is spinal bone, it has a little hollow circle. And these hollow circles provide sort of a tube, a tunnel, that allows the spinal cord to pass through. So the spinal cord will hook into your brain and then pass through that hollow tunnel all the way down your spine to your tailbone. Okay? So that's the hollow we're talking about, the cavity, the hole we're talking about that your spinal cord sits inside of. It's not the same thing as your spine bones, but it's continuous with the hole in your skull that holds your brain. Okay. The second big cavity outside the dorsal cavity is the ventral cavity. So if you recall the term ventral and dorsal, ventral means belly, dorsal means back. So hey, the cavity that sits in where your spine is the dorsal cavity, and the cavity that includes where your belly is the ventral cavity. So the ventral cavity, the hard pocket is the blue stuff here. The whole thing is a hard pocket. And all the lines you see within this image represent divisions, subdivisions within this bigger pocket. But if there is a division, it's either imaginary, one of them is imaginary, or made of really thin, soft membranes or muscle. Okay, so the ventral cavity is the belly side pocket. All right. This pocket holds a lot of organs. It holds your heart, muscle, when I say heart muscle, sorry, your heart, your lungs, your stomach, your liver, just a lot of what we call vital organs. So vital organs are organs that are critical to staying alive. So your dorsal cavity just holds your two organs, your brain and your spinal cord, while your ventral cavity holds a lot more numerous and diverse types of organs than your dorsal cavity, though both of them still hold key organs that you need to live. You can't live without a brain. But you also can't live without a heart, which is found in the ventral cavity. All right, so the ventral cavity is actually broken up into two specific areas called the thoracic and abdominal pelvic membrane. So within this cavity, there's two kind of softer or smaller cavities that are divided by what's called a diaphragm. So a diaphragm is different than those really soft, thin membranes we talked about. A diaphragm is like this sheet of muscle that's found right underneath the lungs. So this sheet of muscle spans right above your stomach and your liver, and it creates kind of a strong division between all the organs above the diaphragm, which is in your chest, and all the organs below your diaphragm, which is your belly, your abdomen, and your pelvic region, so your belly organs or digestive organs. This is actually really nice. It creates kind of a seal. So if you realize this, your digestive organs have a lot of bacteria. So let's say you get injured in your stomach area. This actually prevents the bacteria from maybe your intestines from getting as much opportunity to get towards where your lung is or where your heart, because there's kind of a soft wall there. This wall, though, isn't made of bone and muscle, so it's not as thick. You can cut through the diaphragm, but it requires a sharp object, like a pair of scissors or like a puncture wound or something to get past that diaphragm wall. Most organ stuff can't pass through it on its own. Okay? So it's a thickish piece of muscle. So the way you might want to think of it is, think of a membrane as a curtain, and think of this diaphragm as using like bookshelves, like a line of bookshelves to separate a room versus curtains, which is what membranes would do. So you have all those organs in the ventral cavity, and we actually have a special name for them. We call these soft organs that sit within either the dorsal cavity or the ventral cavity viscera. But because there's so many more organs in the ventral cavity, we tend to use the term viscera to refer to ventral cavities, and then we say brain or spinal cord for the organs in the dorsal cavity rather than calling it viscera. If you know the word eviscerate, like if you watch a lot of horror movies, eviscerate means like someone gets loses their organs, their softer organs inside their belly. That directly refers to the term viscera. So viscera are the soft organs in the front side of your body. So all these organs are viscera. Okay, so let's go into the thoracic cavity. So the thoracic cavity is all the organs in and above the abdominal region. So this is all thoracic. This is all the thoracic cavity. Okay? So it's a chest cavity above the diaphragm. And within that chest cavity, there's a lot of more tinier cavities. So that's easier to see in this image here. And all those lines that you see, those are actually formed by membranes. And those membranes are like dividing your room up using curtains rather than using bookshelves or solid walls. Okay? So within your thoracic cavity, there's individual pockets made of membranes where your lungs lie. Okay? These are called the left and right pleural cavities. So if you recall, this is the patient's left. So the left side is actually over here. So that's the left one. And then this is the right pleural cavity. Okay? Because that's the patient's left and right. But it's the pockets where your lungs would sit. The mediastinum is a little bit of a confusing term. A lot of students think it's just the yellow stuff is the mediastinum. That is not true. The mediastinum refers to this, let me get a decent color, this entire region between the two lung pleural cavities. So the things I just marked up in blue, that's the mediastinum. Okay? So the mediastinum is the pocket between the lungs that hold major organs that have to pass between the lung area. So that includes your heart, as well as the esophagus and your trachea. The trachea is a tube that leads from your mouth to your lungs. Or actually, not quite your mouth, but your neck to your lungs. But these organs do pass through that middle region. Now within the mediastinum, so it's part of the mediastinum, there's a little bit of a smaller section here, which has its own pocket as well. So it's sort of like a curtained off tiny area within this smaller curtained off area. And this area is called the pericardium. So it's a tiny individual pocket where the heart can be that sits inside the mediastinum area. So this is the pericardium, and this is the pericardium from a side view, but pericardium is sitting right here. Pocket containing your heart. All of these in the thoracic area, each of these pockets have their own unique membrane, that thin film. So why would they do this? Well, if you think about it, the heart is constantly moving and jumping up and down. The lungs are constantly moving and jumping up and down. Or not jumping up and down, getting bigger and smaller. And because they're moving so much, they have the potential to rub up against a lot of organs. By putting them within their own little curtain, their own little pocketed off area, they're much less likely to get in the way of another organ and to get stuck or kind of twisted or tangled with something else that also has to move around in the ventral cavity, and in particular the thoracic cavity. Because remember, our lungs are inflating and our heart is beating all within the same room. So imagine 3 people all running around very quickly inside a room. You kind of want to mark the lanes where they should stay. And that's why they all have their own individual little cavity pockets. So this pocket here is where the pericardium is, and this is sort of like a model of the thoracic cavity. And then this over here is my pleural cavity pocket, etc. Okay? All right, so let's go to the area below the diaphragm. So we have our ventral cavity, and above our ventral cavity, we have our thoracic, above the diaphragm that divides our ventral cavity into two parts. We have our thoracic cavity, our chest cavity, and then we have our belly cavity, which is the abdominal pelvic cavity right here. So it is down here is the abdominal pelvic cavity. Now, I actually don't like this image over here because it makes it look like there's a division, a membrane at least, a minimum a membrane at least, separating the abdomen area from the pelvic area. But that's not true. In reality, it's an imaginary division we make, and there's no true separation between where the abdomen area is, where the pelvis area is. So this actually would be better off as a dashed line, which is why I find this image to be more accurate. So abdominal pelvic area is an imaginary line that kind of separates the abdomen from approximately where we would say the organs that sit inside your pelvis, your pelvic bone area, lie. Okay? So there's no true cavity. It's sort of an arbitrary and made-up divisions we scientists, anatomists made up to just go, okay, so those are the organs in this area down here are the organs that are sitting where your pelvis bones are. The abdominal cavity mainly holds your digestive organs, while the pelvic cavity mainly holds a little bit of some digestive organs like your lower colon and rectum. But big thing here is a lot of your urinary and reproductive system is found in your pelvic cavity area, which is your reproductive organs and your urinary bladder. So again, it's sort of an arbitrary division, so really this image should be dashed for abdominal cavity, separated from pelvic cavity. So the abdominal pelvic region, all the organs kind of sit there. They are attached in predictable ways, and we'll talk about it later on how, because it's such a huge cavity with many, many organs, how doctors identify the specific area of the abdominal pelvic cavity where someone may be injured, or and number down what organs they should study to diagnose someone. All right, this is another image of the different cavities. Okay, so if you got a little confused, here's a quick chart to help you kind of figure it out, or kind of like number down what's going on. So we have our body cavities, and there's two big players here. So we have our dorsal cavity and our ventral cavity separation. Within our dorsal cavity, we have our two smaller cavities that aren't truly divided, of the spinal cavity and the cranial cavity, though, again, these are kind of arbitrary breaks. They're actually, the dorsal cavity is just one big pocket with no membrane separation between between the spinal and cranial in the dorsal area. Though within the ventral cavity, there are separations. So the diaphragm muscle, in this case, actually creates a clean division using those bookshelves rather than walls. So the walls separate dorsal and ventral. The bookshelves separate the thoracic from the abdominal pelvic. Okay, so there is a decent amount of separation there. The abdominal pelvic, though, has an arbitrary or made-up separation between the pelvic and abdomen regions. They actually all run continuous. However, within the thoracic regions, while our divisions aren't as sturdy as the diaphragm, we have those thin membrane curtains to help us provide some separation between the various cavities within the thoracic region. And you have the separate membranes breaking it into two pleural pockets, as well as mediastinum region, which is between the two pleural pockets, which has a smaller division within it called the pericardium. Okay? So kind of hope that helps you kind of identify and break down the various different cavities. One thing you ought to have is have some kind of image printed out or drawn out for yourself that you can use as a quick reference for where the cavities are found. And you may want to draw down this diagram map as well so you don't get confused by all the various cavities. Again, you may want to kind of draw at least a rough image like this so you identify and label it with all the terms we learned in this lecture. So, the takeaways for today are that you want to remember cavities are pockets or regions inside the body that hold and protect organs, and they're kept separate from each other using membranes or some other kind of tissue like bone and muscle or diaphragms. All right. Of our two major body cavities, our ventral and our dorsal cavity, they each have smaller regions / cavities. However, the only one that actually has tissues that help separate the cavities is the cavity separation between the abdominal pelvic region and the thoracic region in the ventral cavity, and then the smaller breakdown of the cavities within the thoracic cavity in the chest. Okay? All right. That concludes our notes for the day. Move on to whatever else work you have. Bye.